Hello friends, welcome back. In today's topic, we'll be discussing about cell membrane. Why do we need to study cell membrane? The first and foremost requirement to study cell membrane is to understand about the boundary, or you can say a margin which differentiates the cell from the external environment, and why the cell membrane is present as a barrier for the transport of the substances, because the cell needs many nutrition which it can take from the extracellular environment, and the cell produce metabolically many waste product which the cell wants to give out. For example, the cell needs oxygen, it will take the oxygen from the external environment, and it produces carbon dioxide which it needs to give out as a part of its metabolic waste. So all these exchanges occurs by cell membrane. Therefore, the study of the cell membrane becomes very important to understand how the substance move across the cell membrane and how the transport process occurs across the cell membrane. So cell membrane becomes an integral part to understand the processes of the cell and transport across membrane. To begin with, let us try to see what are the components of the cell membrane. The cell membrane is composed of three basic molecules: the lipids, the proteins, and the carbohydrates. There are three basic molecules of which the cell membrane is composed. Lipids, they form almost 42% of the cell membrane. On an average, every cell has 42% of its component or consist of lipids. The proteins, they form 55% of the cell membrane. 55% of the cell membrane is of proteins, whereas remaining 3% belongs to carbohydrates. So they are the three basic building blocks of the cell membrane: the proteins, lipids, and the carbohydrates. Lipids form the cell membrane in the terms of phospholipids. Proteins, they form many structural things like channel proteins, transport protein, pumps, exchangers, the adhesion molecules, and many other molecules. The carbohydrates, they give glycosidic linkages as well as some of the antigenic properties to the cell membrane, which help the cell to identify as an entity of its properties of, or the cell is foreign, or the cell is the host cell or the self cell. So protein, lipids, and carbohydrates, they form the integral part of the cell membrane. Let us see each of these parts separately. First of all, let us go with the lipids. Why the lipids are the major part of the cell membrane? See, the cell membrane is also commonly known as a lipid bilayer. Now, why the cell has developed a lipid bilayer as a structure of the cell membrane? Lipid bilayer means there are two layers of lipids. There are two layers of lipids in the cell membrane. A lipid which is commonly called as a phospholipid. A phospholipid. Now this phospholipid is made up of two molecules: a phosphoric end, or you can say a phosphate end, and two lipid chains combined to this phosphoric end. The phosphate moiety and the lipid chains, why this arrangement? If you look at the history, or you can say evolutionary part, the cell has evolved in water. The life itself has evolved in water. And why do we need water? Because water is a universal solvent. Water is a universal solvent. So whatever the molecules or whatever the nutrition the cell needs, cell can take it from water. So hence the cell has developed a water loving molecule or a hydrophilic end called as phosphoric end. So phosphoric forms the hydrophilic end of the membrane. Whereas, why lipid chains are attached now? Why the lipid chains are present? The answer is again, water is a universal solvent. Why is it so? Just imagine if the water can present near the cell membrane, but this water, if it tries to cross the cell membrane, these same water molecules can dissolve the cell itself. The same water molecule, the same water solvent can dissolve the cell itself. So the cell has to develop a mechanism where water can stay near the cell membrane, but the water should not cross the cell membrane. The water should not cross the cell membrane freely. Hence, the cell has developed a very interesting molecule, that's a lipid change to the phosphoric end. The lipid is a hydrophobic moiety. So lipids, they resist water movement. Hydrophobic means they hate water. So we have a hydrophilic molecule and a hydrophobic molecule attached to each other, and because of this arrangement, the phospholipid has got a dual property. It can have water near to it, at the same time it can also resist the water from entering the cell membrane. Okay, so in this way the cell can remain in water, but at the same time it can protect itself from the harmful effects of water. In the similar fashion, the interior of the cell is also water, because ICF is also majorly a water part. So the cell has developed same molecule and placed it in an opposite direction to the interior. So the same molecule phospholipid is placed in a reverse manner in the interior of the cell, and hence we have a lipid bilayer. There are two layers of lipids. One layer is for the outer phospholipid layer, and another one is the inner phospholipid layer. So we have a lipid bilayer as a structure of the cell membrane. On either side the water can stay. The beauty is, on either side, on the interior side and on the exterior side, the water can stay, but water cannot cross the cell membrane directly. The water molecules cannot cross the cell membrane directly. To look at it as a complete structure, let us have a simple diagram of it. If we place all the phospholipid molecule next to each other, we'll have a phosphoric end on the outer side, we'll have a phosphoric end on the inner side, and attached to this phosphoric end we'll have the lipid layer or lipid chains on the interior side. So we will have a lipid chains or a lipid layer on the interior side, and that's how we have a sandwich pattern of the cell membrane, which is a lipid bilayer, So we have a phosphoric end, a water loving layer on the other side, but interior of the cell membrane is water hating. So from either side the cell will attract water molecules, but the inner side will always hate water molecules, and hence it is called as a lipid bilayer. So water can stay on either side. Remember, water can stay on either side of the cell membrane, but water cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. So water can stay on the exterior, water can stay on the interior, but water molecules cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. It can stay on the outer side, it can stay on the inner side, but it cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. So this forms a very, very beautiful arrangement and beautiful molecule for the cell. So the water will remain near the cell membrane. All the things which are dissolved in water, the cell can take it from the water, and all the things which the cell can give out, the cell will give it in the exterior environment. Now how these molecules will cross, that we'll study in this transport across membrane. But let us have few more highlights of this. To this cell membrane, this structure helps us to understand that why we need protein channels or transporters. Why? So see, if we have, just imagine, if we have a molecule, say oxygen, if we have a molecule, let's say oxygen, and we have another molecule, let's say a sodium. Now what's the difference? Let me draw a diagram first. So we'll draw a bilayer, we'll draw a lipid bilayer here. This is one layer, this is the another layer. Okay, so we have a lipid bilayer and interior being the hydrophobic. So we have a lipid bilayer. Now let us assume we have oxygen. Oxygen is more in the outside, that is in the extracellular fluid. ECF forms the outside environment, that is extracellular fluid, whereas the interior of the cell has a fluid called as ICF, called as intracellular fluid. So we have ECF and we have ICF. ECF is the fluid which is outside the cell, ICF is the fluid which is inside the cell. The molecules are going to move either from outside to inside or from inside to outside. Molecules will move, but how and when and where do they move? So let us assume example oxygen. Now oxygen is a molecule which is a neutral. Neutral means it doesn't have any charge as of now. It's a complete molecule. So oxygen can dissolve in water as well as can dissolve very nicely in lipid. So oxygen is a property of getting dissolved in water as well as getting dissolved in the lipids. So oxygen can cross the lipid bilayer directly and can enter inside the cell. So this is a very beautiful idea. All the lipid soluble substances, remember, all the lipid soluble substances which are present in the ECF can cross the lipid bilayer directly and can enter the cell directly. Okay, but water molecules, no, they cannot cross. They cannot cross the lipid bilayer. But oxygen can cross the lipid bilayer because oxygen is lipid soluble. What about sodium now? What about sodium? Let us see for sodium also. For sodium, sodium is more outside the cell, or you can say it is in higher concentration in the ECF. So sodium can come near the cell membrane, but it cannot cross the cell membrane. Why? Because sodium has a charge on it. It's an ion. It's an ion. An ion is a part of an atom which has got charge on it, which has either donated or accepted electrons. So sodium ion cannot cross the lipid bilayer because it is charged particle. It has a charge on it and it is water soluble and is not so easily soluble in the lipids. So sodium cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. So in such way we have sodium, potassium, chlorine, calcium, magnesium, all these ions, they cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly, whereas oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, helium, all these molecules can cross the lipid bilayer directly. So what about the water soluble substances? How will they cross? How will they move through the cell membrane? For them we have arranged a special arrangement, and those are called as proteins. So cell membrane has developed a special structure called as protein molecules. Hence we have lipid as 42% and proteins as 55%. These proteins, they form various structure. We have proteins which are present throughout the through the thickness of the cell membrane. They are called as integral proteins. They are called as integral proteins. Integral proteins are the proteins which are present throughout the thickness of the cell membrane. We also have peripheral proteins which are present on either side of the cell membrane. They act as a receptor. So we have integral proteins and we have peripheral proteins. So we have integral proteins and we have peripheral proteins. So integral proteins are the proteins which are spanning throughout the thickness of the cell membrane, whereas peripheral proteins are the proteins which are present on the periphery, either outside or inside. Peripheral proteins, they mostly act as a receptors, or they help in identifying the cell, type of a cell, or they have some antigenic receptors on them. Integral proteins, they help in attaching of the cell to the another cell, or they act as a transport proteins, or they act as a carrier proteins. Now what about sodium? If you see, a sodium is an ion. So sodium cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. So what should we do? In such case, sodium will have a channel which is specifically made for the sodium ion. This protein will form a channel which is very specific for sodium ion, and sodium ion can move through this channel from outside to inside the cell membrane. So in this way the water soluble substances can cross the lipid bilayer via channels. I'll repeat once again. The cell membrane is composed of three important components. Number one, lipids, which is in the form of phospholipids, proteins, which are integral or peripheral proteins, and carbohydrates. The building block of the cell membrane are the phospholipids. Phospholipids, they give the cell membrane a dual property, hydrophilic as well as hydrophobic. The hydrophilic substances can stay all near to the cell membrane. Water can stay near the cell membrane, but it cannot cross the cell membrane directly. Whereas the lipid soluble substances like gases can cross the lipid bilayer directly. So oxygen can cross the lipid bilayer directly, but sodium cannot cross. So for substances which are water soluble, we have made channels. Channels are nothing but the gaps or small areas through which the ions can move or water soluble substances can move. Similarly, for water, even for water, the cell has developed a special structure, and they are called as aquaporins. So even for a water, we have a special water molecule, and it's called as aquaporins. So these aquaporins are nothing but channels which are for water molecules. So water molecules can move through these aquaporins. So water cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly, but it can move through those channels which are made for water, called as aquaporins. So these are the very important things which you need to remember when we will be discussing the transport across membrane. The cell membrane has a very dynamic structure in which the cell can stay inside the water, but also it can prevent itself from the harmful effects of water. Okay, so we'll see in the next topic how these phospholipids or these molecules can form various structures in a body. They can form various structures. We'll throw some more light on how different types of phospholipids, they form different structures. The first we have studied about the lipid bilayer. Let us discuss one more structure which is formed in our body because of phospholipids. The another structure which is formed because of phospholipid is called as a micelle. A micelle is a structure which is made up of single layer, a monolayer of phospholipids. A single layer, or you can say a monolayer of phospholipids, form a micelle. A micelle is generally seen in digestion process, a digestive protein, digestion of lipids. So we have a monolayer of phospholipids which is present in digestive system called as bile. So this micelle is also another structure which is formed by the phospholipids. Micelle or micelle. Micelle is helping in the transport process. It also helps in digestion of the lipids and storage of the lipid molecules. So here this bile, for example, bile helps in lipid digestion by forming micelle. Okay, another structure formed by phospholipid is known as a surfactant. Another structure is called as surfactant. Surfactant are the structures which are formed by the phospholipids when they form a single layer, not a globular but a single layer, a laminar layer on a water surface. So if suppose we have a water surface, let us have a water surface first. So a cell, or you can say the membrane where we have a water surface, and this water surface will have a single layer of phospholipids where phosphoric end is towards the water and the lipid chains are facing away from the water. This type of arrangement is seen in alveoli. In the alveoli, where alveoli are covered with a layer of water and they have surfactant as a molecule to prevent the collapsing of the alveoli. So the phospholipids form three types of you can say structure in the body: a surfactant, which is a single laminar layer, a micelle, which is a single layer globular layer, and a lipid bilayer, which is a cell membrane. These three layers are very typically formed by the cell membrane, or you can say the phospholipids: surfactants, micelle, which is for the production of lipid, for example, and a lipid bilayer, which we have discussed, which is around surrounding all the cell membrane and the cell organelles. So just to have an idea that what are the different structures we have in our body which are present because of phospholipids. So let us just revise for what we have studied till now. A phospholipid is a building block of the cell membrane. 42% of the cell membrane is of lipids. Phospholipids have an amphipathic nature, in which it has a hydrophilic as well as hydrophobic molecules coming together. The hydrophobic moieties are interior of the cell membrane and hydrophilic are the exterior of the cell membrane. So water can stay near the cell membrane, but water cannot cross the cell membrane. These same phospholipids can form a monolayer and a single globular like structure called as micelle, which is helping digestion of the lipids. A layer of phospholipids is formed a laminar layer on water surfaces called as surfactant. All of these have their own purpose in various areas of the body. Let us see what does the lipid bilayer does. The lipid bilayer helps in transport across cell membrane. The water soluble substances and lipid soluble substances, they have to cross the cell membrane, but they cross in a different manner. The lipid soluble substances, which are very easily lipid soluble, they can cross the cell membrane directly. For example, oxygen can move from outside to inside, and carbon dioxide can move from inside to outside the cell very easily. Whereas the water soluble substances like ions, sodium, chlorine, calcium, magnesium, they cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. And because they cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly, they have been transported, for their movement we have developed the channels through which they can move. The channels are, you can say, the windows, or you can say they are the passages through which the water soluble substances can move. Like for example, just take a very vague example. Like we as in human beings, we are not wall soluble, but you can say the X-rays are wall soluble, means they, just to give an analogy, so X-rays can cross the wall very easily. They can cross from outside to inside to outside the room. They can move very easily. But for us, if we have to move inside the room, we have to use a door. Via door we can move inside the room, and via door we can move outside the room. We cannot cross the room moving through the wall directly. Similarly, substances which are lipid soluble can cross the lipid bilayer directly, but substances which are water soluble cannot cross the lipid bilayer directly. So these basics will help us to understand the future topic and the further topic, that is transport across membrane. So stay tuned, we'll come here with the next topic, that is transport across membrane. Till then, thank you, have a nice day.